proud to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Kelly Weinersmith. Dr. Weinersmith is an adjunct faculty member in the biosciences department at Rice University in Texas, but she lives over in Virginia. She studies parasites that manipulate the behavior of their hosts, and her research has been featured in The Atlantic, National Geographic, BBC World Science, and Nature. Kelly is also the co-author of the New York Times best-selling book, Soonish, 10 Emerging Technologies That'll Improve and or Ruin Everything. Take it away, Kelly.
All right. Can everybody hear? And everybody can hear me okay, right? All right, sweet. I am super excited to be here today. I really appreciate the invitation. I kind of love talking about parasites, which is sort of funny because if you had told me that I was going to be studying parasites when I was in middle school or high school, I would have told you that you are definitely nuts because parasites are super gross and there's no way I'm going to spend my life studying them. But sort of as I've gotten older, I still recognize that parasites are super gross, and the ones that infect people I like the least of all. But they also have really fascinating life cycles and they do crazy, interesting things. And so hopefully by the end, I'll convince you that parasites might still be gross, but there's also some interesting things worth knowing about them. So let's start by talking about symbiosis. So parasitism is a kind of symbiosis. A symbiosis happens when you have two individuals from different species that are living together and living together really close. Like often they're like physically touching and they're living together for a long time. So this is different than something like predation, where like a wolf comes in and kills a deer. That's a very quick interaction, whereas symbioses tend to take a long time. So over a lot of the lifetime of two organisms, they are living together closely. There's three different kinds of symbioses. There's mutualisms, where it's mutually beneficial. So both the host and the symbiont are doing better because they are together. A popular example are clownfish and anemones. So an anemone has these sort of stinging cells. So if most fish species come by, they get stung by them. But the clownfish has adapted to not get stung by them. So it lives inside of the anemone and it doesn't get stung. And for a long time, we thought that this just benefited the clownfish and didn't benefit the anemone. But it looks like the anemone also benefits because the clownfish eats little invertebrates that might do harm to the anemone. So it eats little things that might try to eat the anemone also. And we now think that some of the poop from the clownfish is good for providing nutrients for the anemone. And so sort of the more we study these things, the more we sort of shift between the different categories. So, you know, we thought that this wasn't a mutualism, but now we think maybe it is. Biology is difficult that way. Commensalism is an interaction where the symbiont benefits, but the host is neither harmed nor helped. So the host is like, whatever, doesn't even realize it's happening. For example, there's a cannonball jellyfish, which sort of moves around in the ocean consuming zooplankton. And can you guys see my pointer yeah, okay, great. So there's a little crab here on the jellyfish, and the crab isn't hurting the jellyfish, it's just going for a free ride, and it's eating the zooplankton also. So this probably doesn't hurt the jellyfish, it probably doesn't even know that the crab is there, but the crab is benefiting from having a free ride and getting access to some cool food. And finally, there's parasitism, where the host is definitely harmed and the symbiont benefits. So let's talk about some examples of parasitism. So if you are looking for parasites in the tree of life, 4 of the branches where you're likely to find parasites are the ones that I list here. So for example, the platyhelminthes include things like tapeworms, which I think a lot of people have heard of. They've been in the news recently. Some people got tapeworms from eating sushi, and the tapeworms were long and gross, and they made some records, and it's never pleasant. And then there's trematodes. So you may have heard of schistosomiasis. This is a trematode that is common in Asia and Africa. It starts its life in snails, and it reproduces inside the snails, and then it sends a stage out into the water. And that stage swims around until it finds the host, which in some cases is people. And then it burrows through skin and then lives in our veins and arteries. And this parasite can cause some problems, especially if people are infected by a lot of them. And when people urinate or defecate and that gets back into the water system, snails can get infected again, and the cycle starts again. So this is one of many parasites for which having a good sanitation system can do a lot to protect people. Another group of parasites are the nematodes. I honestly think these are the creepiest looking of the parasites, but that's just my personal bias. Nematodes in the US, in some areas, again, where we have poor sanitation, hookworm can be a problem. So hookworm is a parasite that lives in our guts, and it produces eggs that pass with feces. And if those feces don't end up in a proper sanitation area, like, in a pit that's 6 feet deep, then those eggs can hatch and the parasites can crawl out. And if someone steps on them, those parasites can burrow into the skin and infect someone. We've managed to mostly get this parasite under control by having good sanitation, but it's really important that we keep sanitation high and make sure that people aren't getting infected by stuff like this. This parasite down here is guinea worm. This is a problem in Africa. This parasite has a stage that lives in the water, and it gets into a tiny little crustacean that's hard to see. And sometimes when people drink, they accidentally drink this infected little invertebrate also. And the parasite lives in us. And when it needs to release its eggs, it burrows out of the skin and releases eggs. And if your foot is in water, which is pretty common because this parasite causes a burning sensation when it leaves, so people stick their foot in water. When a foot is in water, the parasite releases its eggs, and that sort of starts the cycle again. But there have been massive efforts to try to eradicate this parasite, for example, by giving people straws that have filters so that you can't accidentally consume those infected little invertebrates. And we're coming pretty close to being able to say that this parasite can get added to the list of parasites and pathogens that humans have driven to extinction. So that's an exciting public health story. Other parasites include arthropods. So for example, in the corner here, there's a crustacean. And so crustaceans include things like crabs and crayfish. And this little isopod gets into a fish's mouth, clings to the fish's tongue. In some cases, it makes the tongue fall off. In others, the tongue stays there. And that parasite will live in the fish's mouth and grab little bits of food that the fish is eating. So it's bad for the fish, especially when it loses its tongue. And it's losing a bit of meal to having this little organism living in its mouth, which is super creepy, but also kind of fascinating. There are also parasitoids. So these are insects. And what parasitoids do is they tend to kill their host, but it takes them a while to do it. So there are a lot of insects that are parasitoids where they lay their eggs inside of another insect, and those eggs take a while to hatch. And when they hatch, they eat the insides of the insect. And when they're done, they sort of emerge from the insect's body. It's super creepy. And this is what I'm studying now. So I also think it's great because it doesn't happen to people. Finally, there's a bit of debate actually about whether or not things like bed bugs and mosquitoes should be considered parasites. Some people argue that they should be micro predators because they take tiny little blood meals and then they leave. But other people still want them to be considered parasites. And I just mentioned this to point out that biology doesn't always fit nicely. Nature doesn't always fit nicely into our categories. And so we just do the best we can. Okay, protozoans are the final group of parasitic organisms. And these include things like Giardia, which is over here. Some people say that Giardia kind of looks like an old man. Here's his eyes with like a long mustache. So people joke that he's old man Giardia. This is a parasite that you can get by drinking water in lakes and streams that happen to have infected animals pooping into it. If you're a parasitologist, you end up talking about poop a lot. I'm sorry, it's just my job. And so this became the infection that this parasite causes has been called beaver fever because a bunch of hikers got infected because there were some infected beavers in the area and they drank the water in the stream with the beaver. So anyway, people who get Giardia have fevers and diarrhea, and it's rather unpleasant. And then of course there's malaria, which is a problem in Africa. It causes very high fevers, it causes a lot of mortality, and it has been plaguing the human species for many, many generations. So I've given you a little bit of an overview, and that was like a super fast overview of the way that parasites live and how parasites look. And, maybe you've picked up already that there's a lot of diversity there. There's lots of different ways that parasites infect their hosts. Parasites look super different. Like a mosquito looks nothing like a tapeworm. And so there's lots of diversity, and that also means there's lots of different diversity in the kinds of things that parasitologists do. And so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about careers in parasitology and the various things that we do. So for example, you can be an academic researcher at a university. So you can go to school and get your bachelor's degree and your PhD. And we study things like malaria in birds. So Dr. Leticia Soares studies malaria in birds. And to be honest, when I learned that malaria also infects birds and monkeys and lizards, that kind of blew my mind. I thought of malaria as an exclusively human disease, but it infects lots of things. And so mosquitoes are transmitting malaria to people, to lizards, to birds. And in fact, malaria and mosquitoes sort of got imported into Hawaii, and it's been a big problem for some of their native birds. So anyway, malaria is something that we study. Dr. Vanessa Azenwa studies how multiple parasites interact with each other. So if you pluck an animal out of the woods, just about anywhere you go, that animal is probably infected by more than one parasite species. And so she tries to study how those parasites interact with one another inside of the host and how much worse it is for a host to be infected by one parasite versus two parasites. So she looks at how parasites interact with one another. You, of course, could be a medical doctor and a researcher. Dr. Bobby Pritt develops tests for diseases that are transmitted by mosquitoes and ticks. And so if you come into the doctor and you're feeling kind of crummy and the doctor can't figure out why, but thinks maybe you have some parasite living in your blood, then they'll take a little blood sample and they'll send it out and it might get analyzed by a test that Bobby has come up with, and they'll figure out if you have malaria or Lyme disease or something, for example. You could work for the government. Kevin Lafferty works for the United States Geological Survey, and he studies parasites in food webs. So you've probably learned about food webs in your biology class. They show you the connections between who is eating who in these systems, and they can get super complicated. And they only get more complicated when you add parasites. But parasites are pretty important. So Kevin studies parasites in salt marshes. And when you go out into a salt marsh, you can't see the parasites because they're tiny and they're living inside of their host. So they're easy to sort of ignore. But he went out there and he measured those parasites. And what he found was that if you were to put birds on one side of a scale, and birds are the main predators in these salt marshes, they eat things like the fish and the crabs that you find out there. So if you were to put all the top predators on one side of a scale, and then you were to extract all of the parasites out of the hosts and stick them on another scale, the parasites would weigh as much, or in some systems, even more than the birds. So the mass of parasites is equal to the mass of predators out there. And those parasites are also sort of eating and taking nutrients away from the hosts. So they're important in trying to understand what's happening in these ecosystems, but they're really hard to study. And Kevin tries to go ahead and study them. Dr. Leah Bauer works for the Forest Service under the United States Department of Agriculture, and she tries to do battle with invasive species. So in particular, she studies the emerald ash borer, which is a beetle that came over from Asia and is killing our native ash trees. In Asia, this beetle is actually not a problem. And one of the reasons that it's not a problem is because it has parasitoids. And so these are those wasps that I was talking about earlier that go around and they lay their eggs inside of other insects. So parasitoids are keeping the beetles in check by killing a bunch of them. And so she does research to try to figure out, if we could bring some of those parasitoids from Asia, can they maybe control the beetle population and help save our trees? So parasitoids are, in some cases, an important part of forest management plans. There's veterinary parasitologists. The pets that we love get infected by parasites also. And Dr. Susan Little studies ticks and the diseases that they spread, in particular, the diseases that they spread to our pets. For example, my adorable dog Biscuit has Lyme right now, and we're treating her for that. And we were happy that the veterinarian caught that. And so people like Susan Little studies that and tries to make sure that our pets stay safe. There's museum curators. One of my favorite museum curators is Anna Phillips. She works at the Smithsonian Institution and she studies leeches and tapeworms. So I know I said that nematodes are a little bit creepy. I also think that leeches are a little bit creepy, and you can't tell my parasitologist friends that because I'm not supposed to think that any parasites are creepy, but I think they're a little creepy. And Anna is one of the coolest people I know because they don't bother her at all. And so when she needs to find leeches, she pulls up her pant legs and walks into lakes where she thinks there's leeches. And she does this little like leech dance because leeches are attracted to turbulence. So, if a deer is like walking around in the water to get a drink, they create ripples and sort of leeches can feel that the water is moving and they move towards it because there's a potential host there. So she just goes out there and dances in lakes and streams to try to attract leeches to her legs. She's one tough gal. I wouldn't do that. Then there's industry scientists. So for example, Dr. Bill Campbell worked for Merck and he created a drug called ivermectin. And then he won a Nobel Prize because after creating it, he really pushed to get this drug shared widely in Africa, where it was very helpful in treating some parasitic diseases. So what do I do? This is a question my parents still ask me to this day because I have sort of a weird combination of things that I do for my life. So I write books like Ryan mentioned, that sort of funds my life. And then I am adjunct with Rice University, but I live in Virginia where I'm starting a small ecology research station. One of the things that I want to start studying are gall wasps and their parasitoids. So gall wasps are little wasps. These aren't the kinds of things you'd have to worry about stinging you. They can like fit on the tip of your pinky. They're very tiny. And they're parasites of trees, the way that I think of them. So they lay their eggs in various parts of the tree. So it could be the leaves, the stems, the roots, the catkins. They lay them just about anywhere. And then they manipulate the tree into producing a gall. And inside of the gall, they lay an egg. And inside the gall, you get this nutritious tissue lining that the tree doesn't usually make, but it seems to be making it special for the wasp. And the wasp hatches out of its egg and eats this nutritious tissue. And then the gall additionally helps protect it from parasitoids. So now if a parasitoid wants to try to infect this little baby wasp, it has to get an egg through the gall and then into the wasp. And that's a little bit harder than just getting it into a wasp that's living free. So these galls both provide food and they provide shelter. And this isn't necessarily good for the tree. The tree doesn't want to be feeding the wasps, and it doesn't want to be providing a home for these wasps. And so the wasps are living with the tree for a long time and taking some of its energy. The wasp that I've done most of my work on so far lives on sand live oaks. And sand live oaks, I just absolutely adore these trees. I think they're totally beautiful. You see these in Florida, Mississippi, Texas, sort of the southeasterny part of the states. And they have these like long bendy branches and the moss hangs off of them. They're like the quintessential southern tree. And there's a bunch of gall wasps that live on this tree and produce different kinds of galls that look quite different from one another. The species that I study is the crypt gall wasp. So what happens here is that the mom gall wasp lays an egg into stems and only into stems. That's where they specialize. And the gall that gets formed is called a crypt. And it's called that because it's sort of cryptic. It's a little bit hard to see. It's not as obvious as some of the other galls. And it's just sort of like a little compartment, almost sort of like a little tomb that it lives in. And as I mentioned, the gall gets lined with nutritious tissue. The egg hatches. And then this little wasp eats that nutritious tissue and goes through a couple more stages of development. Down here, you can see a stem where I used a razor blade to remove a bit of bark. And here is one crypt with a wasp that's just about old enough to emerge. And here's another crypt with a wasp that's just about old enough to emerge. And when they're old enough to emerge, they use these specialized mouth parts that they have to chew a hole out, and they go off to complete their life cycle. So if you're looking at branches of trees and you see tiny, almost perfectly cut holes, that might be a spot where a gall wasp has lived, undergone development, and then left. So this is not particularly good for the tree because, one, I've mentioned that the wasp babies eat some of the tree tissue. But two, if you've learned about tree biology, you know that through those stems, you get sort of water and nutrients sort of moving through the tree out to the leaves. And if you have all of these little sort of like holes in the middle of the stem, it makes it hard for the tree to pass nutrients and water back and forth out to the leaves and to get waste material out. So these aren't particularly good for the tree. So I think of these as parasites of trees. So My collaborator noted he went out to this one site and he brought a stem back and he found all of these holes, which is what you would expect when a crypt gall wasp emerges the way it usually does. But he also found that there were a bunch of heads stuck plugging the hole. So this little brown thing that you see here with a little bit of gray, this is the head of a crypt gall wasp, and this is one of its eyes. And so what this wasp did was it started to make an emergence hole, and then it got stuck. And, just like people, insects make mistakes. Sometimes gall wasps get stuck when they're trying to leave. But usually when they get stuck, they don't get stuck at their head. So usually they make a hole that's big enough for their head to get through, but they weren't smart enough to make sure that the rest of their body could get through. So they tend to get stuck at what I think of as their shoulders. So their head gets out, but their shoulders get stuck and they can't get out all the way. So it's weird for them to get stuck at this point where they should be able to still use their mouth parts to make the hole bigger. And so my collaborator thought, well, that's kind of weird. I wonder what's happening. And he knew that I study parasites that manipulate host behavior. So I study parasites that make hosts do things that are bad for the host, but good for the parasite. And I had previously been studying a trematode parasite that lives on the brains of fish. I'd be happy to talk about that later if anyone has any questions. But he called me into the lab and he said, my gall wasps are doing this super weird thing where they're getting stuck. And every time one of them gets stuck, when I dissect open the crypt, what I find inside is another wasp. And this wasp inside is a parasitoid. So whenever the gall wasp was stuck plugging a hole, there was a parasite, a parasitoid in particular, inside. So this is species 1, and this is species 2. And this is the parasitoid species. And so he was wondering, what the heck is happening there? Is the parasitoid making the host do this? And if so, why? So the first thing we did was we took some branches that had these host heads that were plugging the holes, and we stuck them in a cup and we waited to see what emerged. So it's hard to identify insects when they're at this juvenile stage. So we wanted to see what the adults look like. And this beauty is what emerged. So I know you've got to be kind of a weird person to think that wasps are beautiful, but like this wasp, depending on how you shine the light on it, in some cases it looks purple, in some cases it looks blue, under other like sort of light directions it looks green and yellow. It just has this beautiful exoskeleton. And then it also looks like it has super cute little boots. Anyway, I think this is a really cool parasitoid. This is what emerged. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we named it in a moment. But let me first finish telling you about the life cycle. So here's what happens with this parasitoid. So as we've talked about, the gall wasp, which is a parasite of the tree, but I'm now going to call it a host because it's now getting infected by a parasitoid. So the host is now, it's a baby wasp growing in a crypt. The parasitoid mom comes along and lays an egg inside of the gall along with the host. The host is now manipulated into making a smaller than usual emergence hole, and then it gets stuck. And as someone who's claustrophobic, this next stage really freaks me out. It is now not only stuck in this tunnel from which it will never escape, but the parasitoid is now hungry and it eats the inside of the host. And so you end up with a dead host whose head is plugging the hole. Yeah, and so as a claustrophobic person, this is just awful. But anyway, so the parasitoid then finishes its own development. It goes from being a juvenile to an adult. And the whole time the host head is plugging the hole. And when the parasitoid is ready to leave, it chews a hole through the head of its host and it goes off to complete the rest of its life cycle. So we first wanted to know why this is happening. And so what we did was we took a tiny little piece of tree bark and we put it on top of the head of some of these hosts that were plugging the hole. And what we found was that the parasitoids were 3 times more likely to die trapped inside of the crypt if they had to get through a tiny little bit of bark than if they only had to get through the head of the host. So it seems like what's happening is that this parasitoid doesn't have the right mouth parts to get out of the crypt on its own. So it manipulates the host into making an exit hole and then plugging it with its head so the parasitoid can still eat the rest of the host. And then when the parasitoid is done, it leaves through the head, which is much easier to get through than tree tissue and tree bark. So it looks like this manipulation helps the parasitoid escape. So we now had this parasitoid, and we had sort of a story about what was going on. And so we used some scientific keys to try to figure out who this parasitoid was. And it turned out that the parasitoid, we were able to figure out where it generally falls on the tree of life. It fell into a genus called Euderus. So somebody had already found wasps sort of like this one, but nothing quite like this one, which meant that it was a species that was new to science. So we named it the crypt keeper wasp, which is sort of a reference to a creepy movie or TV series that I watched when I was a kid. Maybe some of the teachers recognize it, but I'm guessing almost no one else does. But we also gave it the scientific name Euderus Set. And the Set part was after the Egyptian god Set. So he was the god of sort of evil things. And since this parasitoid is manipulating a parasite of the trees, it sort of seemed like, oh, he's controlling other evil things. That seemed like a nice connection. Additionally, Set trapped his brother Osiris in a crypt. And that seems like a pretty cool connection. One wasp trapping another wasp in a crypt. And additionally, Set tore his brother up and scattered his body. And the crypt keeper wasp is a pretty messy eater. And when you go and dissect these crypts, the host body parts are sort of all around the crypt afterwards. So we named this Euderus Set after the Egyptian god Set. And it was really fun to have the opportunity to describe and name a species. That was something I've always wanted to do since I was a kid. And it was kind of cool to get a chance to do it. Okay, so that is a little bit about parasites, about careers in parasitology, and about what I do as a parasitologist. Hopefully it wasn't too creepy, but you can't kind of study parasites without a little bit of creepiness. So you can now ask me anything. For example, you can ask me questions about parasites, but I have to add the disclaimer that I am an ecological parasitologist. So I've studied parasites of fish and insects. I am not a medical parasitologist, so I can't answer medical questions, although I can try to answer some questions about human parasites if you have them, but I can't do any diagnoses. I can tell you about training necessary to become a parasitologist, the importance of math and writing, or you can literally ask me anything you want about careers in science or careers in parasitology or my weird research. I'm happy to talk to you about anything. Okay, thanks. Let's do some questions.
Yay, thank you so much, Kelly. That was awesome.
Yeah, my pleasure.
So teachers, students, feel free to use the raise hand feature, unmute yourselves to ask questions, type questions in the chat. I will go ahead and get the ball rolling with, maybe I missed it, but I didn't see you give any examples of plants that are parasites. Do plants also have parasitic lifestyles?
Yeah, though that's a good question. There are some plants that are parasites, and they sort of like hook into other plants and steal their nutrients. So if I was to talk about all the different branches of life that had parasites, then we could be here for quite a long time. And so I was mostly focusing on the branches of life that have like sort of a significant chunk of the organisms in them that are parasites. But yes, there are definitely some trees that are parasites, and there's also some fungus that are parasites, and those are super interesting. And then you get back to biologists arguing about definitions. Maybe fungi are more pathogens than parasites, but anyway, fungus are interesting too.
Yeah, for sure. We have a question from Klein's class, and their question is, how long does it take to do these types of studies?
Oh, that's a great question. So it really depends on the system that you're studying. So for the study that I just talked about, where we were describing the species and we were trying to figure out how this weird behavior benefited the parasitoid, that took probably a year. So we, in year one, my buddy Scott sort of made the observation that something weird was happening. And then we had to wait a season for it to happen again. So a year later, we went out and we collected a lot more stems where this was happening. And we did those experiments where we put a little bark on there, and then we did the identifications. And that process took about a year. And then it took a couple more months to write up. I've also studied a trematode parasite that goes from snails to fish to birds. So it lives in snails. It produces a free swimming stage that leaves the snail and then infects fish. It burrows through the fish's body and then goes up to the fish's head and lives on the brain. And then when the fish gets eaten by a bird, the parasite transmits from the fish to the bird, then it lives in the bird's gut, and they make eggs in the bird's gut, and when the bird defecates, the poop goes into the salt marsh where it gets eaten by the snail, and the cycle starts again. To study that system and really understand what's happening, those fish are pretty long-lived, and so those experiments can last for a couple years, and it actually took us a couple years to figure out how to keep the fish happy in the lab and how to keep the snails happy in the lab and how to work with the parasites. So sometimes it takes a couple years to establish a system in the lab, and then it just sort of depends on how fast stuff happens in nature and how long the organisms live.
Awesome. I'm gonna maybe ask you to stop sharing your screen just so we can go back to a gallery view and see everybody. If folks want to turn their cameras on, they don't have to. And if you need to share your screen again, Kelly, to answer any of these questions, that's totally cool. One other question we got is, what kind of education do you need to study in this field? I know you talked about a lot of different careers, but what was the educational pathway to get there?
Yeah, so it really depends. So for a lot of the people that I talked about, it is the case that we went to school and we got our bachelor's degree. Some of us also got a master's degree. And then we went to either med school, vet school, or a PhD program. So I went to the University of California, Davis, and got a degree in ecology. And now I study parasites. So it can be a long road. But there are definitely people who work on like agriculture related questions, and they study parasitoids, and they have somewhere between a bachelor's to a master's degree. So it is pretty common to at least have some college education, and in a lot of cases also more advanced grad school degrees. But grad school is not always necessary to work in this field.
And then Catherine, students also want to know, what do you like best about your job?
I love that I get to spend a lot of time outside. So when I get to, go outside and try to find these galls to bring them back into the lab, that a lot of my job involves like literally just sitting outside and staring at trees to see like, is something interesting happening? Is anything weird happening here? And just sort of trying to understand the interactions requires a fair bit of time outside. I also really like reading and writing and statistics and coding, and that is all important for trying to understand what other people have found and then trying to understand what the things you have observed really mean. But I think the outside part is what I like the most.
And then Julia's class wants to know, is there a type of parasite that is more frequently identified in nature than others?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, I guess it really depends on what host you're focusing on. So like, for trees, fungus and gall wasps are a pretty common problem, particularly for oak trees. There's a lot of nematodes and tapeworms. Birds have a lot of malaria. And so it kind of depends on what host you're interested in and what part of the world you're in. And that's another thing that's so fun about parasitology, is that if you do a dissection in one part of the world versus another part of the world, you might get totally different parasites. And so there's a lot to study. And I know totally different parasites isn't an exciting idea to everybody, but it's sort of an exciting idea to me.
And then Catherine's class just studied owls and dissected some owl pellets, which I also got to do in school, and I love doing that. Do you know of any parasites that are specific to owls?
I know I can't say that I've studied owl parasites, but I would guess that in that pellet, you might have also, you wouldn't have been able to see them because you wouldn't have probably had them under a fine enough microscope, but there's probably eggs from tapeworms in there. So probably those owls, when they ate mice, those mice were probably infected with tapeworms, and they had stages that were sort of living in their muscles. And when the owl ate them, the stage became an adult in the gut of the owl and produced eggs that leave with, when the owl pukes things up or poops things out, the eggs probably go out also. And there might also be some nematodes in there, and possibly some trematodes.
And you did mention it with your fish studies, but there are parasites that try to get their host eaten by a specific other kind of animal to keep their life cycle going. So that is something you might expect to see in nature.
Yeah, totally.
All right, well, Catherine's class had to jump off, but Julia's class wants to know, what inspired you to become a parasitologist?
So I started parasitology studying parasites of fish, which is really surprising because I used to think parasites were gross, and I definitely hate the smell of fish, and that's still true today. But I read this book called Parasite Rex by Carl Zimmer, And he was talking about how there's this fish that has a parasite living on its brain, and the fish that are infected do weird things like flip over or break the surface of the water, which creates a ripple. And they do these things that draw the attention of predatory birds, and it gets the fish more likely to be eaten by birds. And the parasite needs that because it needs to get from fish to birds to complete its life cycle. So here are these fish that are doing these crazy behaviors that are totally bad for them, but totally great for the parasites and maybe even good for the birds because they get an easy meal. And it just amazed me that these teeny tiny little parasites could be living on the brains of fish and controlling their behavior, but not making them seem sick otherwise. So like these fish aren't like swimming on their sides and looking like they're about to die. They look totally healthy otherwise, but they just every once in a while do something really conspicuous. And just the idea that parasites could have this sort of subtle control over host behavior really amazed me. And at the time, I was particularly interested in why animals differ in their behavior, and the possibility that parasites could be explaining why some individuals behave one way and why some individuals behave another way was a really exciting idea to me. And so that's how I got into parasites.
And then Klein's class is interested in learning what kind of salary expectations there are for folks working with parasites in those sorts of jobs.
Yeah, good question. So it depends a lot on exactly what you're doing. So like if you end up going to med school and you become a medical doctor who also does some research, or I guess I don't know what veterinarians get paid, but I know medical doctors get paid fairly well. And I know that folks at pharmaceutical companies, if you sort of get up the ladder and you become a very good person at making drugs to treat parasites, then you get paid well. I have neither of those jobs, so I don't know exactly what those numbers are, but you'll have a big house, I assume. If you decide to be an ecological parasitologist, then you get, for example, you can get like professor pay, which starting is about 50,000-ish, and then it goes up over the course of your career, and it depends on whether you get a job at Harvard or somewhere else. I think they pay more at Harvard. So it kind of depends on exactly what job you get. If you work for the government, I know you get really great benefits. You probably don't get a Mercedes like you maybe do if you are working for a pharmaceutical company. So there's a fair bit of variability in salary expectations. But as far as I know, all of the salaries are nice, more than livable.
And then if anyone else has any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat or turn the camera on and just wave me down to unmute. But I have a few other things I'll ask you, and then we can sort of wrap things up. Are there examples in nature where you can't really tell what kind of mutualism it is? Like you can't tell if it's a parasite or a symbiosis or mutualism?
Yeah. So the clownfish example, I mean, that's one where we had to study it for a long time before we felt like we really understood what interactions were happening there. There's other interactions where under some conditions, the partners seem to help each other out, but under other conditions, they don't. So for example, if they're working together and like feed or sharing nutrients, and then all of a sudden one of them has more than enough food and the other doesn't because the environment has changed in some way, then it might shift to a parasitism. So the point is that these things can change over time, and they change as we understand them better. And nature doesn't like fitting in the boxes that we make for her. And that's just the reality of being a biologist.
Absolutely.
But it makes things interesting. Yeah.
And are there ways that animals or really any other organism tend to like defend? Do they like try to come up with a defense against the parasites, or it seems like the parasites always win in the stories you were telling?
Well, no, they definitely don't always win. So there are there's a lot of different levels of defense. So there's the immune system level, which was probably what comes to mind for most of us immediately. But then there's also like behavioral defenses. So one of the things that also got me interested in parasites is that behavior can influence how many parasites you encounter and what kinds of parasites you encounter. So for example, fish that are less active in some systems pick up fewer parasites than fish that are more active. And then for example, and that's because there's some free swimming stages of parasites. And so fish that don't move around much don't encounter a lot of them, whereas fish that are moving around a lot are covering more space and are more likely to encounter some of them. And then there's other behavioral things you can do. So for example, in the Australian Great Barrier Reef, there are cleaning stations. So there are fish whose job it is to pick parasites off. So fish will go up to the special cleaner fish and sort of let the cleaner fish check all around them, and they'll pull the parasites off. And that is an example of another mutualism where one parasite gets a nice snack because they can eat the parasites without it hurting them, and the other parasite gets cleaned. But that's another example where when conditions shift, it's not so good. So for example, if you're just going for your regular parasite checkup and there's nothing to be found, sometimes those cleaner fish will like pick off a little bit of skin or pick off some other bits of the fish to eat and pretend they're cleaning parasites. But since there's nothing there, they just want to get a treat.
Oh, wow.
And and so that's every once in a while, those cleaner fish do things that aren't so nice, and that sort of shifts from one sort of category of symbiosis to another.
Is that similar to how like monkeys and apes will clean each other, like groom each other with the...
That's another anti-parasite example. Yeah, I don't know examples of that interaction turning bad. I think that's usually just beneficial to have somebody help you clean the parasites off. And so, yeah, there's lots of behavioral things that animals do, especially when the parasites are living on the outside of them. So those are called ectoparasites. So especially when you have ectoparasites, there's behavioral things you do where you can get help from other species or other members of your own species to try to remove them.
Awesome. Well, last question for you, unless anyone else types anything in the chat, is you sort of walked us through the story of identifying and naming this crypt keeper wasp. And so what sort of comes next in your research? Are you working on the same system? Are you shifting gears? Where are you going from here?
Yeah, so one of the next things we did was try to see if this parasitoid is manipulating any other species. And we found that it's manipulating at least 6 other species in North America. So this is happening, possibly even on trees in your area. The host isn't the crypt keeper wasp. It's living on a different kind of oak, but this could be happening right outside your door. And then we're trying to figure out how the parasitoid manipulates host behavior. How does it make the host get stuck? Why doesn't the host just chew its way out and then totally leave? And so yeah, there's still lots to try to figure out in this system. And, you sometimes find this parasitoid infecting gall wasps that live on leaves, which are easier to get through than the stems. And so maybe it's less beneficial to manipulate a gall wasp that lives on a leaf than one that lives in a stem. So maybe the benefit depends on how hard it is to get out of these crypts. And so just sort of understanding when this behavior is good for the parasitoid and how it does it is our next step.
Awesome. Well, with that, I think we're going to wrap it up for today's seminar. Thank you so much, Kelly, for giving us some of your time. Thank you so much to all the teachers and classrooms that were able to attend. I know we had some folks drop off who will be getting the recording for this later if they want to show it to other classes they teach. But yeah, this was excellent. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with all of us, Kelly.
Thanks for having me. I had fun, and there's not a lot of other Weinersmiths online. So if anybody has any follow-up questions, you can find me easily online. And please feel free to shoot me an email. Anybody, I'm happy to answer questions at any time.
Yes, and I put my email in the chat for the teachers that are still here, but you should all have my email. And so if you need to reach out to Kelly, you can reach her through me as well. I'm happy to share her email with folks. And have a great rest of your day, and see you all at the next seminar in 2 weeks.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.